Alan Wake released on the 360 on May 14, 2010. It was Remedy Entertainment's first new IP after their smash hit games Max Payne 1 and 2 that had put Finland on the map as a premier game developer. Written by the face of Max Payne, it was inspired by the writings of Stephen King as well as cult classic TV shows like Lost and Twin Peaks. And for their newest game, Remedy decided to create a new game engine that would allow them to fully utilize the next generation of consoles' power. This decision, however, ultimately ended up causing a lot of trouble during the game's development. Eventually though, the game saw the light of day, and after one final showing at E3, back when people still pretended to play games on stage, the game was ready to take on the world. However, releasing on the same day as Red Dead Redemption didn't do the game any favors, and it only sold 145,000 copies during its first 2 weeks. And just like the show it was inspired by, the franchise was put into limbo, only to return years later, aided by fans who through word of mouth managed to spread the game to a wider audience. And with Alan Wake 2 on the horizon, I think it's time to revisit everyone's favorite fleshlight simulator, because this game is not a lake, it's an ocean. If you're the kind of person that likes coffee, The Twilight Zone, David Lynch and heavy metal, this yes might be the game for you, because not only are the waters of Twin Peaks running through this game's very veins, it also has a very heavy Stephen King influence. The game follows writer Alan Wake, who's been suffering from writer's block for some time, so he and his wife Alice go on a vacation in an idyllic Pacific Northwest town called Bright Falls. However, it doesn't take long before things take a turn for the worse, and Alice is kidnapped by an entity known as the Dark Presence, and Alan is caught up in a nightmare where a story he doesn't even remember writing is coming true before his very eyes. And Alan has to save his wife and figure out what is going on, while shadowy figures called the Taken are out to stop him. And while other Remedy games saw characters like Jesse using the powers of telekinesis, while Max Payne was flying through the air in slow motion when fighting enemies, Alan Wake has a flashlight. And while the game is a classic in the genre now, upon release this was one of the many criticisms that the game received, and in order to understand why, we need to take a look at the game's troubled development. Oh no! So development on Alan Wake started after Remedy had finished work on their previous title Max Payne 2, and realizing they wanted to create a game with a deeper narrative than before, the studio started building new tools and technology in order to achieve this task. And while a household name today, back then lead writer Sam Lake was just coming off of his first success with the Max Payne series, where he had served as a lead writer on the neo-noir third-person shooter, and had played a huge part in making the game a success by focusing on the game's narrative and allowing it to stand out compared to its peers. However, for Alan Wake, he felt that the hero needed to be more relatable than the action heroes of yesteryear, and made Alan Wake more of an everyman. And relatable he is, because what self-respecting man hasn't been found running around a dark forest at night narrating his own life while hunting down his estranged wife while beating down any locals standing in his way? Originally, the game was set to be an open world experience centered on a Twin Peaks style town that the players could explore, with an early E3 build even showing the game having a day and night cycle and strange hooded people would hunt him down at night. However, after finding that such an open world design meant that they had to make compromises with gameplay and storytelling, the idea was scrapped in favor of semi-open linear areas that could drive the narrative forward in a more concise manner. The mood of the game was also being affected, and seeing how a thriller needs its up and downs to be carefully curated, it meant that if the player can simply run off and start a logging career instead of saving his wife, the atmosphere and illusion of urgency is all but evaporated. All wasn't lost, however, and all those late nights studying tornado behavior finally paid off when the game released in 2010. Looking back on it though, Sam Lake reflected that had the game taken a more straightforward path to create, it probably wouldn't have become the Alan Wake we know today, as all of the struggles that they went through helped shape the game into the one that millions of fans adore still to this day. Now, while a lot of people have reduced the combat in Alan Wake to simply being a flashlight simulator, I think this is a bit of an oversimplification, as the moment-to-moment gameplay is surprisingly polished compared to most other horror titles. Because while the game is filled with dialogues and cutscenes, the levels are usually one long sequence of good old-fashioned third-person shooting, and in your arsenal you have a revolver, a shotgun and a rifle that are all useful in their own way, as you're fighting to take down the primary enemies of the game, the Taken, people shielded by shadows that need to be burned away with a light before they can be damaged. And in order to accomplish this, Alan of course has a handy flashlight, which is balanced by the fact that it's powered by the Duracell bunny after a wild night out of town, and only lasts a few seconds. There are also flares and flashbangs that will take care of most crowds of enemies. And if you want to, combat can even be skipped entirely in some cases by just making a mad dash for the nearest light post, which serves as the game's save station. Well, sometimes you can. Because running away is harder than it seems, as enemies are faster than you and things can quickly turn into a frustrating dodge fest that will get you easily killed. Now, before we go further, even with just this basic introduction to the gameplay, I feel like we need to talk about the elephant in the room, which is that this game has always been heavily criticized for its combat, with the main issue being that for a game about a writer having the power to alter reality, Alan sure does seem to be lacking a lot of creativity, as almost all of the game's enemies are basically just humans that you have to point a light at and then shoot over and over and over again. And while this description is not untrue, while playing, it never really feels like the gameplay loop is as basic as it is, as the moment-to-moment action is still just fun to play. And there's actually a lot of variety that gets introduced over time, with enemies that are faster as well as big and bulky ones. And later on, flying enemies are introduced, as well as inanimate objects that come to life that unfortunately take an absurd amount of light to destroy. However, while these objects are easily the worst part of the combat, we do get some pretty cool looking vehicle fights out of it, so there's that. There's also some pretty visually interesting car combat sections that are essentially leftovers from the previous open world design that really showcase how big of a world they were aiming for originally. The game also has light survival horror mechanics in that ammo conservation can be necessary on higher difficulties, and you'll just have to run away from enemies to the nearest save point. There are some quirks about the combat though, like when aiming your flashlight, it's really easy to essentially stun lock large crowds of enemies, which reduces the stress of the moment-to-moment gameplay a bit too much for my liking. The game also has a pretty intense auto-aim system due to there being no crosshair, meaning that you just spray and pray in the general direction of enemies and you feel badass doing so, but it doesn't really allow for the horror of the game to shine. Despite all of this, however, the combat never manages to get old or stale, while the game manages to maintain an air of mystery and oppression. Sam Lake once said that the story can be viewed as a metaphor for a long and difficult writing project, and you can really feel this while playing the game, with the disjointed manuscript pages, the Stephen King references, and the world design. And for a game released in 2010, the graphics look absolutely breathtaking, and the lush forests and scenery are still impressive to this day. And although I am playing on the remastered version, it still stands as a testament that good art direction is far more important than graphics. But what really sells the atmosphere is the world building, which aside from being delivered through the story is also told in-game via radio calls, where you can listen in on callers reporting on what's happening around them right as it's happening to you, adding to the sense that this is in fact a real town where everyone else is also feeling the effects of what is happening around them right along with you. There are also TV stations showing strange things happening, my favorite being the TV show Night Springs, a completely optional and missable show inspired by the Twilight Zone. Each episode deals with strange and eerie concepts and offers a nice break in between the action. Alan can also watch himself on the TV, with the occasional TV showing Alan inside a dark place trying to write his escape, and at one point he even sort of notices that someone is watching him. And interestingly enough, this is the only time that a TV is not just shutting down but actually breaks, as if the dark presence doesn't want you to see anymore. Keeping in line with the visual fidelity and new and improved storytelling, the audio department got an upgrade as well. Gone were the tech-noir inspired music of Max Payne, and instead an orchestra was used that really captures the mood of the game, and along with some heavy metal, actually makes for a really unique and awesome soundtrack. The sound design is also really cool, like when shining a light at enemies, it sounds like some shrieking demonic entity as it burns away their darkness shields. And in terms of story, you can tell that they put some thought into it, because Alice is not just a damsel in distress, with several New York flashbacks showing us that it's actually Alan that's a bit of a rock star writer that keeps drinking too much, and Alice seemingly the one keeping them together, which makes sense since it was her idea to try and get Alan on a vacation for his writer's block to begin with, which in turn makes saving her feel that much more important, as she's actually, you know, a good person. So all in all, the atmosphere is what makes this game stand out, but even then it would have all faded into darkness if it weren't for the story itself. The game starts with Alan Wake arriving in the town of Bright Falls with his wife Alice, who has brought him here on vacation due to Alan's writer's block. They arrive in town and Alan goes to a local diner in order to pick up a key from a guy named Stucky. However, Stucky can't make it, and instead he comes across some locals, including the Anderson brothers, two brothers suffering from dementia, as well as an old lady who seems very fond of her lamp. Alan is then greeted by a mysterious woman, and considering the selection of town folks he's met so far, he probably doesn't think twice about her Grim Reaper-like appearance, and grabs the key and heads off to their cabin located at an idyllic island in the middle of Cauldron Lake. At the lake, Alice, written as a well-meaning and sympathetic character, brought a typewriter and arranged for Alan to see a psychologist named Dr. Hartman, who helps creative people with their problems. And because telling creative people they have a problem always ends well, Alan storms out of the house, and after trying to cool down for a bit, he hears Alice screaming and runs for her, but whatever took her has already dragged her down the lake, with Alan jumping in to save her. He wakes up 1 week later in a crashed car with no memory of what happened, and decides that the best course of action is to run through the forest to a nearby gas station in order to get help. On his way, he is met by a shadowy figure who drops a manuscript page with the title Departure, a book that Alan hasn't actually written yet. And after managing to get help, he's met by Sheriff Breaker, who informs him that the island at Cauldron Lake hasn't existed since a volcanic eruption in the 1970s. And after being taken in for a medical checkup, he's introduced to Dr. Hartman, the psychologist Alice was talking about. And after exchanging knuckle sandwiches, his friend and manager Barry is introduced, who serves as the comic relief of the game.
Hey, nobody move! Get your hands off of my client!
Who are you?
I'm Barry Wheeler, his agent.
Alan then leaves only to get a phone call from a kidnapper who supposedly has Alice and will hand her over for the manuscript pages for departure. And this is where the nightmare truly begins, because while Sheriff Breaker eventually warms up to Alan and helps him and Barry on the way, there's an out-of-town FBI agent called Robert Nightingale who really doesn't enjoy his latest assignment, and he is determined to bring Wake down. Alan is also tricked by the dark presence possessing the woman from the diner in the introduction, and is knocked out, which further delays his quest to save Alice. Oh, and did I mention that there's a man in a diving suit that is emitting light guiding Alan along his way? And after going through hell to get to the kidnapper, he sees the lady who gave him the cabin key, and it's also revealed that during his blackout he wrote almost an entire book which explains all the manuscript pages found everywhere. Alan and the kidnapper are then thrown into a lake by a darkness tornado. After which, Alan wakes up at Dr. Hartman's clinic as a patient, and apparently everything that happened since Alice fell into the lake was just hallucinations, and he's actually been in the clinic ever since. Or not, as it was all a lie told by Dr. Hartman, because he knows about the power of the lake and just wanted Alan to keep writing, as the clinic is sort of his testing ground and he uses creative people to influence the lake. The dark presence attacks and Alan flees with Barry, and it's here that they finally figure out what is going on, and we learn that the dark presence is trapped beneath Cauldron Lake in an alternate dimension known as the Dark Place. It has the power to alter reality through people and needs a creative writer like Alan to write a story where it escapes. And as it turns out, the man in the diving suit is actually a poet named Thomas Zane, who the Dark Presence had tried to use before. He, however, managed to write a story that ended with the island at Cauldron Lake sinking, but in doing so, sacrificed himself in the process. Alan and Barry then get drunk, where Alan sees himself trapped in the Dark Place, where the Dark Presence, who is actually wearing Thomas Zane's wife's Barbara Jagger's skin, is holding Alice hostage and is making Alan write write a story where it can escape its current confines. However, since it has been tricked before by Zane, it carefully monitors Alan, who somehow still manages to write himself a way to escape, starting with the car crash in the beginning of the game, and the current story now unfolding are just from the manuscript pages he wrote while captive. But wait a minute. Why are the Taken who are under the control of the Dark Presence trying to kill Alan? Well, it's a bit hard to tell. Alan himself says it's because the story has to feel real and have all the dangers that make a true story exciting, possibly to trick the Dark Presence and keep it on edge. Another theory is that, because as we see from the Control DLC, Alan's sanity is slowly withering away, and it could be that the Dark Presence is just pretending to want to kill him in order to delay him until he loses his sanity and it can gain full control over him. Either way, Alan and Barry don't wake up only to find that Nightingale has caught up with them and gets put into a jail cell where one of the coolest scenes in the game takes place.
Wait a minute. I know.
After which, Alan, Barry, and Sheriff Breaker, who is now convinced of the danger, head to the town's power plant to meet a woman named Cynthia Weaver, or as it turns out, the lamp lady from the beginning of the game, who has been waiting for Alan to show up and has stored an item known as the Clicker in a place called Well-Lit Room. Apparently, she has been maintaining the room for decades in order to keep the darkness at bay. This Clicker actually turns out to be a toy that his mother gave to Alan as a child to help him overcome his fear of the dark. He takes the Clicker and heads back to Cauldron Lake, where he defeats the Dark Presence using it. It's here that he realizes that light and darkness, guilt and shame all have to be balanced, so he rewrites the story so that Alice is saved and never drowns, and with himself mysteriously disappearing in her place. And so ends the story of Alan Wake, with the town of Bright Falls celebrating Deerfest, an Agent Nightingale glaring out from an apartment, and somewhere in a cabin lost in a dream sits Alan Wake, trapped in a dark place but somehow still managing to finish his book before the winds of winter will ever come out.
As you might have already seen or heard from the Xbox reveal event, we are working on something new, something big, which of course means that the next big game from Remedy won't be Alan Wake 2.
Those were the seemingly final words spoken by Sam Lake before Alan Wake was put to rest forever. Game development is tough, and it's not an easy feat bringing artists, musicians, programmers, writers, managers all united under one vision in order to pitch something to publishers that may or may not decide that you are not worth their time and money. But Remedy has come a long way since the days of Alan Wake, with Control showing us that they can still nail the eerie Twin Peaks style horror while still appealing to a mass audience. And that, in combination with the game's enduring fanbase, we will now get an Alan Wake 2, which Sam Lake himself has stated is the version of Alan Wake 2 he's the most glad that they went forward with. And if there's one thing that the team at Remedy has always been, it's passionate. So let's hope that Alan Wake 2 is as good as we want it to be. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.